The dead mother of all contagions. In one chapter from Defacing the Ancient Persia, Parsani writes, I come from a culture for which death is not only ossified, but also pulverized into a grey powder, an abominable dust, which then attracts cosmic wetness and moisture in order to make a necrophilic mess. This strange and ambiguous statement is then extended through two analyses which unfold Parsani's avid exploration of the theme of dust as the desired object of monotheistic Zoroastrianism and the Middle Eastern doppelganger of aqua vitae. Evidently, Middle Eastern epics and narratives are by nature very dusty, observes the Lebanese interviewer. In the Middle East, spiritual journeys, abreactive trances, otherworldly expeditions, explorations, wayfaring, even political rallies, and mysterious missions for obscure objectives take place through dust and deserts rather than rivers and seas. Civilizations are buried under deserts rather than sinking beneath oceans. Ships are found in dead seas. Deities breathe dust and sear worlds. This construction of everything together out of dust, considered in the context of the Middle East, is nothing less than a realism, albeit a speculative one. Dust is our superweapon, infected with bad karma. You have said that nothing is more characteristically Middle Eastern than the monotheistic, essentially Zoroastrian phrase, dust to dust. Where does all this dust come from in your works? The interviewer asks Parsani. Dust is all we have here in the Middle East. It is all that we can consume without fear of ever losing it. Parsani's response begins. Breathe as deeply as you will, dust will never be depleted. If the profound hostility of the Middle East towards being settled, even as a geographic entity, cannot be fully grasped, this is because even its terrestrial bedrock, its concrete ground, is progressively eroding and degenerating into dust. Parsani names dust the Middle Eastern unit of information, or sometimes even that Middle Eastern relic from which nothing can escape. If the tendency of dust lies in the direction of a becoming particle, naughtness, as well as wetness, dust is hydrophilic by nature, because its emergence is accompanied by dehydration and evaporation of moisture, then the terms zero, dry, and data might relay the full import of Parsani's reference to dust. Zero data, or dust, swarms planetary bodies as the primal flux of data, or the mother of all data streams in the solar system. Each particle of dust carries with it a unique vision of matter, movement, collectivity, interaction, affect, differentiation, composition, and infinite darkness. A crystallized database, or a plot ready to combine and react, to be narrated on and through something. There is no line of narration more concrete than a stream of dust particles. Interstellar dust was involved in the formation of stars and planetary bodies. Earth, as a rebel disciple of the sun, is shelled with dust particles from within and without. For this reason, there is no fiction more original, in terms of schizophrenia, collectivity of writers, movements of different plots, composition, rich in authenticity, and jargons, than the earth itself, the earth composed of dust particles and fluxes. Here Parsani's remark that the Middle East is the dust swamp of the earth develops a fictional edge saturated by new literary theoretical problematics of storytelling. In Defacing the Ancient Persia, Parsani sometimes calls the earth the round jargon. Given that each dust particle envelops and carries different materials and entities from diverse territories, dust particles express particulars of different fields and territories in terms of universals. When dust particles are composed, they combine countless terms, languages, and materials belonging to entirely different kingdoms. Dust particles originate from dark corners never trodden before, different territories, fields of narration, and domains of invisible hazards. Each particle carries crystallized waste matter and essences of different groups and particularities, hard to grasp but easy to commingle with fluid. For Parsani, this fluid, or wetness, essentially for blending the dust particles in the Middle East into one narrative with multiple undertows, is petroleum, or naft, oil. In the Avestan language of ancient Persia, the word naft is the word for wetness itself, If each dust particle emerges from a different territory and is composed of anonymous materials, then dust particles can only settle together and unite once they are moistened by one substance. Only oil can settle the dust of the Middle East, declares Barsani, but dust is a real nomadic entity, because it migrates elsewhere, spiriting itself away as an elusive ground, a bogus state. The pro-creationist chauvinism associated with dust, as seen in monotheism, Barsani continues in his interview, is an ongoing process of composition. Religion never takes creation as a fixed point in time or an outset. It is a continuing and developing process which begets time and space. According to Zoroastrianism, as the rudimentary ovum of monotheism, dust is the most elemental object of creation. It contaminates time as well as space. In the Middle East, time is measured not by the clock, but by dust. Monotheism either misses or intentionally ignores the point that if the divine's creation and order vacuously exploit dust as the irreducible and most primary instance of reductive purity, other agendas too use dust as a compact agent of synthesis, mixture and assortment of countless things from different territories. Not only God, but diseases, deluges, and blinding smogs all employ dust as their primary agent. If dust represents a return to God as one, different particles and hazards too can be crystallized or sporulated as one within a dust particle. For a dust particle, one is always a legion. The purity of dust as an object deliverable to God, from dust to dust, can be perpetuated only as a disguised unity of minute contagions and pollutants. Since the divine's creation always seeks to promote its zeal in dust, the divine's process of creation advocates such hazardous agendas disguised as dust. In this sense, the unity of creation is already the collectivization of diabolical particles. Barsani's remark that the divine itself is a suspicious carrier of diabolical particles, both in its creation and its policies, makes sense here. In his book, Barsani questions the irony of creation. If dust composes creation out of its own logic and order, it is because, for dust, creation is the very essence of sadism, giving birth to something, feeding it, waiting, and then reducing it to dust. If dust is inseparable from creation, it is because creation is always a reducing to dust. What would be the point, for dust, of composing an entity whose purpose is to become dust again, other than to quench a morbid desire? A desire for which creation is a conspiracy to experience the dusting process at a more aggravated intensity. An unabated sadomasochism. Barsani's view on dust, however, drastically changes from a crypto-nihilist position. Dust is not nothing, and there is always something, viz. Dust, to a more characteristically Middle Eastern interrogation and worldview. Rather than enforcing nihil, for Barsani, dust now seems to condense an irreducible complexity stemming from its syncretic approach to everything, a point of view corroborated in horrifically concrete fashion by the Middle East's dense syncretic involvement in global affairs. Dust is the master of collective insurgencies, Barsani continues with the Lebanese interviewer. It is an indivisible part of authority, yet its syncretism unfolds only as an uprising when the crystal thaws, when the spore breaks. Dust's patience in pursuing its obscure ambitions is comparable to the stubborn persistence of creation and its chronological time of past, present, and future. The enthusiasm of dust towards unfolding is always on behalf of the many, crystallized as one particle. Dust simultaneously emerges as the alpha and omega zero data. There is no signal or message other than the compositional insurgency of dust, whose syncretism and obscure politics of creation can be effectively registered or rooted on a flux of dust. Dust is the name of a rebellion marked by utter collectivity and progressing at a cosmic level. There is always an abysmal conspiracy wherever dust begins to engineer a composition or forge a compositional bedrock for a ground or regime. As an interdimensional carrier, dust scavenges xenochemical particles, outsiders, as its cores or constituents, introduces and implants them into compositions, creations, and establishments. A dust particle collects its components from different milieus so distant from one another that they can operate for each other only as outsiders. When dust is utilized in creation to compose and concoct, it turns the object, or to be precise, the created composition, into a fierce operative of horror, with a progressively thickening ominous plot or storyline which might be summarized as follows. As the creation, the body which has been made out of dust, turns to dust once more, the outsiders which were consolidated within each spore or crystal surface are released. The release of these multiplicities, disguised as one within each dust particle, is equal to the arrival of the alien, not from without, but from within. As in the case of a spore about to break open and release its bacteria, this emergence of new life forms and collective particles might be apprehended as an insider takeover, the rise of a new people. Reducing to dust is thus neither a monotheistic oversimplification nor a reduction. It minimally denotes a process by which a new people are liberated from the authorial whole, the structure, the body, the creation, as it degenerates into dust. Everything that has resided within and has never been active in its original outsiding form will come forth. In dealing with dust, as in dealing with the earth and the Middle East, the insider always precedes the outsider in unfolding its exteriority, its radical insurgency, and its flight from the authority of the whole. In releasing latent and dormant agencies within each spore or dust particle, the role of the outsider is replaced by the insider. When considering dust, the earth, and the Middle East, one must always think of the inside. Barsani's analogy of the Middle East's terminal minority multiplicity, or the rise of minorities, minority holocaust, with dust, and the extreme way it liberates the outsiders, which have already been condensed and crystallized as insiders, can be traced through the panorama of reduction to dust. Quote, "For the rest of the world, especially Westerners, the Middle East is just a region filled with ragtag states within states, a dense constellation of every type of scum on earth. The Middle East is a socio-political disparagement, not even constituting a solid region, but just randomly populating itself in the Middle Eastern regions of the Earth's body. A random terror, at best. And everything Middle Eastern is reducing to dust anyway. But here they precisely miss the point, for the rich diversification and propagation of minorities in the Middle East is in fact the direct consequence of this degeneration to dust, the consequence of releasing the repressed outside, voluntarily favoring it and its people over the established state and its so-called aboriginal people. This is not the whole scenario yet. The Middle East has already found out that it requires a total political as well as social and terrestrial creativity to become conscious and responsible in regard to this dusting process. The Middle East perpetuates this creativity by escalating its own reduction to dust until the earth is populated anew, inundated by minority deluges. When populations and systems turn into dust, they bring forth unheard of things. Sadly enough, the West in particular doesn't understand that there is nothing more ordinary, usual, and perpetual than being reduced to dust, and that they too are part of it. Turning into dust is a sweeping Tellurian event, an event operating in favor of the dormant, the insider, the slumbering." End quote. If the emergence of the outsider is defined by the term awakening, it is because it has already been included as an insider, an intrinsic part of the composition, embedded in the nervous system of the structure as an endemic or domestic agency. In his Notes on Relicology, the study of relics, Barsani notes that the charm of relics as outsiders precisely originates from their autochthonic characteristics, the oscillation between the domestic and the foreign packed into one object. If the outsider is manifested in the persistence of its exteriority and invasiveness, then its advent should not be anticipated from the outside as that which is external to the boundaries, but from the inside, as that which has already invaded the system and now resides within the boundary. Dust, for this reason, is a resident outsider. Quote, In Zoroastrianism, so long as dust is regarded as a particle of a degenerated foulness, such as a corpse or dried bones, it suggests purity. But as soon as it is confronted as a relic or an entity in itself, it becomes an absolutely appalling unit of uncleanness, a homunculus per se. H. Barsani, Notes on Relicology. For dust, awakening is translated as dust to dust, releasing what has already been crystallized in the dust particle. The awakening of the xenochemical insider camouflaged within the composition during the degeneration into dust, from dust to dust, is what makes dust a true abomination, an undercover subject and object of the awakening, both the cult and the quiescent, slumbering crowd. A self-degenerating entity, a volunteer for its own damnation, dust opens new modes of dispersion and of becoming contagious, inventing escape routes as yet unrecorded. In his interview, Barsani suggests that the Middle East has simulated the mechanisms of dusting to mesh together an economy which operates through positive degenerating processes, an economy whose carriers must be extremely nomadic, yet must also bear an ambivalent tendency toward the established system or the ground, an economy whose vehicle and systems never cease to degenerate themselves, for in this way they ensure their permanent molecular dynamism, their contagious distribution and diffusion over the entire global economy, gaining epidemic dispersion by degenerating into particles and mobile hazards. The dust epidemic, which Barsani associates with Middle Eastern policies, or the degenerating process of dust to dust, is not divergent and linear. It is a dynamic field with diverse paths, swirling dust vortices working with different elements and on different axes, corresponding with Trizon cells and feedback spirals, applying different forces and various levels of reducing to dust. Barsani completely disperses his discourse on hidden writing until it becomes as one with his disquisitions on dust. Dustism is the Middle Eastern way of renewing and becoming new for the earth, a course of action which is not taken in favor of or on behalf of solar capitalism and the sun's hegemony. Dustism favors the earth's clandestine autonomy and its rebellion against the domination, whether vitalist or annihilationist, of the sun. The cult of dust celebrates the insider. Dustism inspires a radical and concrete approach to the outside without becoming a solar slave or a sun cultist, a bland disciple lacking autonomy, or a naive inhabitant of the terrestrial sphere. And, well, this is exactly where capitalism, and particularly the US, eat the Middle East's dust. So baked, so dehydrated, dust thirsts for cosmic wetness, for the flood. In monotheism, and especially in Zoroastrianism, dust is usually considered immaculate, but once it makes a pottage with wetness and mist, it becomes the house of abomination, the Drujaskan or Drujestan, the soft, soggy earth and the living mud of inextricable mess, Barsani informs us in Defacing the Ancient Persia. Only years later does Barsani note that the catalyzing wetness for dust, which was cursed by the Zoroastrians and worshipped by Acht and his cult, Achtyatu, was in fact none other than petroleum, or naphtha. The fundamental discovery of the Greek elementalist and cosmogonist tradition, from Empedocles to Aristotle and beyond, was that a dry element thirsts for its wet twin. The dry element thirsts to fuse with its wet twin, thereby to take a new path of existence. The outcome of such a fusion is the emergence of a new sentience out of the contamination between elements. It is precisely in order to conceal the menaces of such a pollution and its contagious potentialities that procreationism and the philosophies of Genesis establish themselves on the dynamics of the entwining of wet and dry as a fundamental attraction, philia. In terms of this elemental attraction, or philia, the solid is as insurgent and activist as the fluid. The thirst of the dry to fuse with the wet refers to the ulterior process of plague engineering secretly running through every procreationist economy and system of Genesis. To this extent, when pro-creationist religions and schools insist that such frantic attractions are the basic procedures through which Genesis and creation constantly refresh themselves, then one can argue that creation must be bound to the emergence of plagues, diseased compositions, mess, and chemical blasphemies. Pro-creationist religions assume that cycles of fusion between dust and wetness bring forth fertilization, but fertility, in terms of mess, only gets messier. Dust as zero data, with its condensed syncretism, is an attractor for foaming plagues on a pandemic scale. If dust has an uncontrollable thirst for wetness, then what guarantees that it only fuses with pure water and does not promiscuously intertwine with every obscure wetness and unholy fluid that lurks in the universe? Parsani asks. In the guise of exorbitant heat, solar capitalism reduces dust and the dusting process to the surplus value of the ground or the Earth's crust. Dust, however, constantly undermines this politico-economic reduction by fusing with every wetness it meets along its path of dispersion. Once fused with wetness, dust returns to the ground as a foaming mess or wet epidemic, the rain, with the power to penetrate the ground to its compositional level, residing there and starting to contaminate both soil and subsoil. This panorama takes the form of a tide toward a mess hysteria, an omega pollution, as the contaminated ground and biosphere turn to dust one more time to get closer to the ultimate purity. By fulfilling creation's cycle of purification, dust to dust, the ground and biosphere contribute to the consummation of dust with wetness, mess. The procreationist cycle of purification is transcendentally carried out through being recycled into dust over and over again. Each cycle brings heavier inundations of pollutant wetness, encompassing more remote variations of chemistry. This cyclical frenzy is called refanging, a political remobilization where the head overlaps and locks onto the tail. The diagram of this dry-wet fusion cycle, dust times wetness equals decreasing ground plus increasing mess equals dust times wetness equals, as an unfolding epidemic, or the thing without genesis, Parsani, is a spiraling Asi, the Avestan dragon of the deep, or a convoluted Ouroboros. Also called the sacred by Act and his cult, the outer Ouroboros passes through three intersecting Ouroboroses, coiled and aligned on three axes which form a trison, a tripedal beast named the Wheel of Pestilence. See Figure 18. Figure 18. The Wheel of Pestilence, or Pestis Lemniscus, as the Romans called it, right, and the aerial view of its trisons, left. The tail-to-fang recurrence of dynamism of Ouroboroses imparts two basic functions to the Wheel of Pestilence. One is a surrounding cyclonic movement which transports trisons along horizontal and vertical axes. The other is propagation of trison cells in the wheel as the result of interactions between trisons which have been twisted as the Hindu-Arabic number 8. Trisons within trisons ad infinitum, corresponding to Parsani's minority holocaust and political meltdown. If the function of the velocipede, or the Ouroboric number 888, is to unbind trisons, and if on the other hand the communication between trison cells is effectuated as a cyclonic disturbance, then the Wheel of Pestilence is equal to a political epidemic. Famine cycles, swarm migrations, pest incursions, and fugue states are all mobilized by the Wheel of Pestilence. In the cycle of epidemics, every time that dust fuses with an otherworldly wetness, immersing into xenochemistry, the composition of the ground is further distanced from creation, both as an instance of creation and as the created. The cycle of epidemics moves in a spiraling manner, or in the form of an Ouroboros, which registers its bestial flight not only as departing from creationism, but also as returning to creation, with fangs ready to poison and devour. Tia materialism. In the same sense, the carnal diagrams of flesh are imbued with dust soups, the ultimate mess. They are mapped by syntheses of dust with xenochemical hydrocurrents and cosmic wetness, and mobilized by the intelligence and vigor of epidemics. This is neither to glorify the flesh in the context of monotheism and its creationist basins, God made you out of dust, nor to pay tribute to the flesh and its carnal politics. It is to declare that flesh is already a reeking catacomb of dust compositions, drenched by deluges. It implies that dust carves niches into this catacomb into which to deposit all the bacterial data it has scavenged from wet milieus, xenochemical planes, interstellar dimensions, and oceanic wastelands. The wetness of the flesh is only the consequence of the dust's thirst for its wet twins. As for the flesh, dust discloses its own endemic sentience in the vicinity of wetness. In terms of dust, flesh is a heap of data pollution, a fanatic practitioner of dustism. Passani returns to the subject of dust and creation at the end of the interview. The opposition of monotheism to carnality is a matter of prohibiting people from playing in cemeteries and catacombs, exhuming what they hold within. Flesh is a dust necropolis, which is constantly refreshed by wetness, a necropolis full of cursed cemeteries, vaults of anonymous materials from the outside, crypts and restless things. Dust is not the surplus of the ground's groundness and the sun's thermonuclear capitalism. Quite on the contrary, authorial genesis and creation are the surplus of the dust's mess hysteria. Creation is the surplus value of the Ouroboros cycle of the past, which lays its eggs via devouring, twisting with Tia materialism. Dust is a dry torrent towards an outside, only plausible as pest. Bacterial relics. Colonel West, as if he himself was doing the counting, proclaimed that dust can contain up to 11,583,800,000 bacteria in 1 ounce. For the first time, he felt content with the quantity of a number. Playfully, rather than seriously, holed up in his hideout, he continued to kill time by reading from the book he had accidentally recovered. Sporulation is a way of becoming an endobacterial relic in hostile environments, nutrient-deprived and dehydrating conditions. It is a way of becoming fully militarized, fortified, camouflaged, and dispersive. The spore, or endobacterial dust, is a relic with untraceable zones of migration and traversal, a swarm particle creeping off the radar screen. A speck of dust you never know whether you have inhaled or not. A spore condenses and envelops a virally hibernated relic in a series of composite membranes generally named the sarcophagus. The sarcophagus is opened up in the form of a rupture in response to a friendly environment or normal climate. The opening of the sarcophagus entails the release of the bacterial relic in what could be compared to a defiling resurrection. Nothing is more vicious and strategic in undermining and attacking normality, hygiene, and survival-friendly environments than a spore. He looked at the Middle Eastern horizon from the window of his room near Musel. Both the window and the horizon were disgustingly dusty. In the Middle East, the model for population, whether of people or systems, is dust, West added to the new pamphlet he was going to distribute among his sons. Then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Take handfuls of soot from a furnace, and have Moses toss it in the air in the presence of Pharaoh. It will become fine dust over the whole land of Egypt, and festering boils will break out on men and animals throughout the land," he whispered to himself. West had already started to meditate on War on Terror, dust, the desert, and how the oil pipeline makes an apparently coherent plot out of all these things. He had come to the conclusion that the coupling of oil and dust narrates the biblical decimal plague in a new progressive format. The War on Terror, with the desert as its platform, requires new methods of customization and morphological programming of war machines. If tactical lines and inclinations of war machines change in the War on Terror and its desert, then even the shape of war machines must be altered to match the new context, terrain, and targets. Morphological programming leads to the emergence of weapons with autonomous nervous systems. The simulation of dust characterizes such a morphologic customization of war machines. From the time of Anzu and Pazuzu to that of Operation Eagle Claw and Operation Desert Freedom, Middle Eastern war has always had a particular interest in dust, cryptospores, and particles. For a Middle Eastern war, war machines must turn into dust particles and spores. In the past, the dominant factors in bioweaponry were the level of toxicity, poison, and complexity of mutations. In the war on terror, the inclination is more toward a morphological customization of weapons. In the war on terror, weapons must be capable of being easily smuggled, afforded, and dispersed, as well as being able to pick up on targets with minimum effort. Dust is all that Middle Easterners can afford, both economically and mentally, West has stated in one of his speeches to his troops. If the morphology of weapons has to undergo a revolution in the war on terror, that revolution can only take place through morphing into dust and spores, providing weapons with a cutting-edge compatibility with the socio-political sphere, belief dynamics, people, and geography of war. The strategy of morphological programming, as West suggested, is to concoct an appetizingly digestible light meal that everyone can afford, a culture-friendly weapon like anthrax spores, corresponding to Middle Eastern dust culture. High spore concentration, uniform particle size, low electrostatic charge to reduce clumping, complex surfaces of spores resulting in aerosolization, that is to say, the becoming dust of the anthrax spore. Sporangium is a folded oval with a high degree of stability, small enough to be inhaled and reside within the lung passages. The Middle East, as the confusing platform of war on terror, is constantly charged by agitations of dusts and spores, or weapons-grade relics, which, chronologically speaking, belong to now, but which, inside the crystal or the spore, carry a hibernated entity from a deep past. The approach of dust and spore to time is subversive rather than ambiguous. They smuggle an unfathomable ancientness into their environments, through now. As they open and unfold, they draw lines of sorcery between time and space. Dust, or spore, is constituted of a relic crystallized or enveloped in a deep past, and a sarcophagus, which is a series of layers formed during time. Only in reaction to the friendly environment of now does the sarcophagus break open, so that the ancient entity can be exhumed. As the enveloped endobacterial thing slumbering within the spore awakens, the existence of dust or spore as an entity bound to present time becomes highly problematic. So that the Middle East, as the dust plateau of the Earth's body, a Tellurian entity which is creatively conscious of its dust, must be seen as the emerging zone of a deep past, a bacterial ancientness. Such a mode of time associated with bacterial relics, dust particles, and spores is always weaponized as it reaches the present and unbinds in now. Artificial now, the Middle Eastern approach to time, is a now preceded and succeeded by an obscure and cryptogenic ancientness, deep past. The only place where this ancientness can be grasped separately and distinctly from tradition is in dust and through dustism. It is dust that harbors the ancient without tradition or ultra-modern ancientness. On the other hand, following the hydrophilic frenzy of dust, the Middle East, as the conscious dust plateau of the Earth's body, uplinks the globe to xenosignals of the cosmic wetness, the pest, roaming, surging, and awaiting to join their wet twin on the Earth. If, from every point of view, the Middle East is very dusty, this does not mean that it is dead. On the contrary, it is fresh and alive through the tides of wetness and lurking waters in the universe and within the Earth's body, which desire to couple with dryness. The ancient wheel of pestilence never broke. It became faster and rounder in the wake of Middle Eastern systems, communication models, and politics. The dustier the Middle East, the swifter the wheel of epidemics. The Middle East, as a never-ending dust plateau, through its conscious and concrete approach to dust, imparts a new politics, economy, and ethics to the once Western industrial capitalist cry of something for the masses. Knitters for peace. Wool is not a petroleum product. Nothing has latched onto the secrecy of dust's pest insurgency, albeit blindly, better than this peace motto. When the malicious wetness of oil is not active, dust or dry gas, its colluding twin, rotates the wheel of pestilence in peaceful quietude. Anthrax dust, historically known as wool sorter's disease, is endemic to soil. It corresponds to the plague infecting livestock, transmitted from their tissue to hair, wool, and its derivative products. How long the wheel of pestilence waited to unfold itself in the semaphoric peace symbol. Colonel West was still meditating. Both the Cold War, World War III, and War on Terror, World War IV, developed as an agglutinated series of dustisms. Each one accelerated the process of erosion to dust, the assembly of the cult of dustism, through its own associated vortex. The former through its post-atomic radioactive dust enterprise, the latter through its bioterrorism, dense fog of war, and dusty geostrategic fields of operation, from Desert Storm to the Middle East and Mesopotamia. If to dust is to kill, dust to dust is to render into nothingness. Hypostician Laboratory. Xerodrome, or the desert of Tellurian Omega, vacillates between two rivers, Mesopotamia, two prowling poles of Tellurian insurgency. The oil pipeline and petropolitics on the one hand, and endobacterial dust and its hydrophilic tide on the other. As soon as they interact with each other and assemble their cults, everything along their line of communication starts to swerve.